They were already saying the northern man would smother his whole cabin in its sleep, for no sound miner in the high diggings of the northern Rocky Mountains built himself a bed of brick and mud and then lit a fire to crawl on top of, and he was a stranger from the cold north of China, laying up a great low platform of clay along the whole back wall of a miner's cabin and running the cook smoke through the inside of it as though a bed were a chimney. In the autumn of 1883, in a raw placer camp called Cold Kettle Bar, strung along a frozen gulch in the northern mountains, Wang Fu-shan built his kang. It was the heated brick bed of his people, a broad, low, hollow platform of mud brick and creek clay laid along the wall, threaded inside with a maze of narrow flues, with the cooking hearth set into one end and the chimney carried up at the far other end, so that every breath of smoke from the day's fire was dragged the whole length of the bed before it was let go. And when it was done, he and the men who shared his cabin unrolled their quilts and slept on top of it, warm on no fire but the one that had cooked their supper. Every practical man in that gulch had done the plain and modern thing, bought a sheet iron stove from the camp store, set it in the middle of a single board cabin, and stacked a great rick of cordwood against the winter. Here was the northerner, they said, sleeping over a fire like a loaf in an oven, running smoke through his own bed. And he would poison the lot of them in the night or set the gulch alight before Christmas. What none of them knew, and what the killing cold to come would teach them at a price, was that Wang Fu-shan's people had been sleeping warm on the kang for 1,000 years in a country whose winters bettered anything the mountains could show, and that the low brick bed he had built along that cabin wall was a furnace one cooking fire could charge with a whole night of warmth, a stove that need never be lit, because it was only ever the kitchen. He had come to that gulch carrying an old knowledge and almost nothing else. He was a broad, heavy-shouldered, deliberate man of about 45, born on a small dry farm on the wind-scoured plains of Shantung in the north of China, where the winters came down off the northern steppe with nothing to break them, and where every house in every village, the poorest hovel and the headman's alike, was built around its kang, the warm brick bed where the families slept and ate and sat out the black months, where the old were nursed and the whole life of the winter was lived on a few feet of heated clay. He had been a farmer, and in the slack of the year a layer of brick and mud like his father before him, so that he knew the building of a kang in his 2 hands the way other men knew their own names. He had come over in the great tide of laborers in the 70s, worked 3 years grading roadbed for the railroad through country that froze as hard as home, and drifted at last up into the high placer gulches where a patient man could still wash a little gold from the cold gravel. He shared a long log cabin with a half-dozen other Chinese miners, most of them from the warm rice country of the South. Men who had never in their lives seen a heated bed and thought the Northerners' talk of one a kind of homesick boasting. Chief among them was a quick, weary young fellow the camp knew as Ah Sing, a Southern man of about 30 who worked the next rocker to Wang's and had decided on no evidence at all that the whole notion of sleeping on warm brick was a Northern madness, and who would, before the winter was out, defend that same brick bed to any man on the bar who would hear him. For Wang Fu-shan knew one plain thing in his bones that the miners around him had never had cause to think through, because they had always warmed a room with a fire and reckoned that was the only way that warmth was made. It was this, that a fire gives a man heat only while it burns, and sends the most of that heat straight up the chimney and away. But that heat poured into brick and clay does not fly off, it soaks in and lingers, and gives itself slowly back for hours after the fire is cold, so that clay, once warmed, is a bank a man may draw upon the whole night long. The kang was built upon that truth and upon one other, cleverer still. A stove standing in the middle of a room threw the whole of its burning up the pipe and out into the sky, and warmed the air, which is the hardest thing in the world to keep and the first to leak away through a board wall. The kang threw nothing away. Its fire was the cooking fire, the same fire, the very same armful of wood, that boiled the rice and the tea, and would have been burned to feed the men in any case, and instead of letting that fire smoke rush straight out a pipe, Wang led it the long way, in at the hearth built into one end of the bed, then through a winding warren of narrow channels walled inside the brick platform, back and forth the whole length of it, so that the hot smoke gave up nearly all its heat to the clay it crawled through before it ever reached the chimney at the far end and escaped. One supper's fire, spent twice over, once to cook the meal, and once again on its way out to charge a ton of brick with a night of warmth. And a man did not lie in the cold air of the room. He lay on the warm bed, under his quilt, in the one warm place, and let the room be as cold as it liked. But knowing that brick banks of fire is one thing, and laying the bed that holds the warmth so it neither chokes the sleepers nor loses its heat is another, and every course of that platform was shaped to its purpose by 1,000 years of northern winters. Wang had no kiln and no bought brick. So he did as the poor of his own country did. He dug clay from the frozen creek bank while he still could, mixed it with cut straw and sand, and shaped and dried a great stack of rough gray mud bricks in the last of the autumn sun, and he gathered flat stones from the diggings for the slabs that would cap it. He laid the platform low and broad along the whole back wall of the cabin, waist high and wide enough for 6 men to lie abreast, and inside it he built the flues, not one straight tunnel, which would have let the smoke race through and warmed nothing, but a patient serpentine of narrow channels turning back on themselves the length of the bed. So the smoke must wander and give up its heat before it found the chimney. He set the cooking hearth into the near end, low with its iron pot lids, and carried the chimney up tall at the far end to pull a strong, steady draft the whole way through. He capped the flues with the flat stones and a thick, smooth skin of clay, sealed tight, so that not a wisp of smoke could weep up into the room where the men breathed. For the whole art of it, the art the camp was too sure of itself to credit, lay in keeping the smoke walled away inside the bed while the heat came up through the clay clean and dry. Then he lit the slow-curing fires that dried the green clay hard. Days of thin smoke standing straight from the chimney while the platform baked itself solid, and it was those firings, and the plain strangeness of a man building a bed he meant to run a fire inside of, that fixed the camp's judgment of him past changing. The laughter had a leader, and his name was Barton Reeve. Reeve was the man who had made the camp pay. He kept the store at Cold Kettle Bar and sold the miners nearly everything they owned, the sheet iron stoves and the stovepipe, the milled board freighted in at ruinous cost, and above all the cordwood, cut and hauled and ricked and sold by the cord to every cabin in the gulch against the long winter. He held the one proud frame house on the bar, 2 stories of clean sawn board with real glass windows, a standing sign of the goods he dealt in. And it was Reeve, more than any man, who took the Northerner's brick bed as a kind of insult, for Wang Fu-shan had walked into his store exactly once, bought a keg of nails and a bar of iron, and not one stick of cordwood, nor 1 foot of board, nor one stove, and gone out again to build his whole winter's warmth out of creek clay and digging stone, and the fire he would have lit to cook by in any case. That a man should winter in that country and buy nothing, no stove, no boards, no wood, struck Reeve as bad for trade and worse for sense, and he made a show of the joke from behind his own counter to every man who came in out of the cold. The heathen was sleeping over a lit fire like a side of bacon in a smokehouse, he would say. He would gas himself and his whole cabin blue in the night, or burn the gulch down to the snow line, and then come begging a stove and a stick of wood on credit. And decent men slept in beds and kept the fire in a stove where God and common sense intended it. And the men warming their hands at his store fire would laugh, and it went up and down the bar, the China miner on Cold Kettle, who slept on a fire. The strangest part of it, and the part Wang Fu-shan could never make them see, was that the proof of the whole thing was not some notion of his own, but the settled practice of a fifth of the living world. And the camp looked straight past it only because that world lay on the far side of an ocean. In the north of China and in Korea and across the whole cold sweep of Manchuria and the Mongolian border, hundreds of millions of people had wintered on the Kang for longer than there had been an America to sail to. Whole provinces colder than these mountains slept every night of every winter on warm brick heated by the kitchen fire, and had done so father to son, for more centuries than the camp could count. It was not a trick and not a gamble. It was simply how half a cold continent kept itself alive, as ordinary there as a chimney was here. But there was not another northern man in the gulch to stand with him, and the southern miners in his own cabin came from a green wet country where no house had ever needed a heated bed. So that even among his own countrymen the Kang was a foreign thing. Wang tried, once or twice, in the little English he had, and the plainer language of pointing and doing, to say that a great part of the world slept warm this way, and had always done so, and the men heard the words and let them go, and went back to feeding their stoves and buying Barton Reeve's wood, and laughed at the one man on Cold Kettle Bar who was doing the most ordinary thing in the world he had come from. Wang let them laugh, for a camp busy laughing leaves a man be, and there was a winter to get ready for. Through the shortening days, he and Ah Sing worked their claim and finished the bed, and slowly the young southern man came round to it. For it is hard to keep laughing at a thing you sleep warm upon every night while the wind rises. They spread woven mats in their quilts along the top of it, and set the tea things in the rice crock at the warm end near the hearth, and made the long cabin, for all its cold board walls, a place a man was glad to come into out of the dark. And the routine of it was the whole secret working in plain sight, had any of the mockers cared to look. There was no heating fire, morning or night. There was only the cooking fire, the small one that boiled the morning rice, and the same at evening, and that fire, doing the work it would have done anyway, was the entire warming of the place. While every stove cabin in the gulch was burning wood by the armful all the waking day and banking it high at night, and their owners were splitting and hauling and stacking against the cold in a kind of fear, Wang laid in a woodpile so small the neighbors took it for the plainest proof yet that the man did not understand the country he had come to, a little stack of creek willow and pine knots, a fraction of the least rick on the bar, because a bed that is warmed by the supper needs no wood of its own. The miners who tramped past and saw the low smoke and the low woodpile were surer than ever the northerner would be frozen or smoked or begging before the deep of the winter. By the end of November, the gulch turned hard, and Wang got his first true proof. Though he was near the only man who marked it for what it was. A savage cold came down one clear night out of the north, the first real one of the season, far below zero and dead still, the kind of cold that finds every crack a board wall owns. In the gray of the morning, the camp woke to misery. The sheet-iron stoves, fed high till the men could no longer keep their eyes open, had burned down to cold ash in the small hours, and the moment the fire failed the cold had walked straight in through the thin single walls, so that the cabins that had glowed like ovens at supper stood by dawn as bitter as the open gulch. And every man rose stiff and swearing to build his fire again from dead ash with fingers that would hardly close, and found the water frozen solid in the bucket a step from the stove. That was the plain price of the stove and board cabin in a hard freeze, and every stove household on Cold Kettle paid it that morning. Wang and his cabin mates did not. They woke on the warm bed to a room that had cooled but little, the brick under their mat still giving up the heat of a fire that had gone out before midnight, and Wang laid the flat of his broad hand on the clay top and felt the warmth still deep in it, a whole night after the little supper fire that had put it there. The tea water stood unfrozen at the warm end. Ah Sing, who a month before had called the bed a madness, slept on warm, and the cabin dog with him. Wang sat a while in the dark with his hand on the warm brick, and there was nothing in it to wonder at. And that was the wonder. It was doing exactly what it had done for his father and his father's father on 1,000 worse mornings than this one. There is a particular loneliness in being the only man in a country who knows a true thing, and Wang Fu-shan had lived inside it since the first smoke rose from his strange chimney, though he bore it more easily than most, for his belief was not truly his alone, it was only alone on Cold Kettle Bar. On the hard, clear nights of that early winter, he would sit late at the warm end of the bed, with the little lamp turned low, the brick ticking faintly beneath him as it gave its heat back into the dark, and go over the whole of it again, the way a careful man checks a sum he has staked his life upon. There was no book in the camp for what he had built, and no man on the bar who would grant it a grain of sense. There was only the knowledge his people had carried down the centuries, that a fire is a spendthrift and brick a saving box, that the smoke a stove throws away is a whole second warmth if a man will only make it wander, that you warm the sleeper and not the sky. And on the cold nights that knowledge was the only voice in the gulch that agreed with him. Every man he could speak to believed the loud and obvious thing, that warmth came from a stove kept roaring and a woodpile kept high. The quiet thing, the warmth asleep in a bed of clay, he alone believed on Cold Kettle Bar, he and the whole cold north of the world he had left, and his grandfather, who had died warm at 90 on a kang, no better than this one. He had chosen long ago which of the two he would trust when the cold came to settle the question, and he trusted it now, and slept warm on it while the frost cracked the green logs of the walls. The killing cold came in January, and it did not come as a storm. There was no blizzard, no wall of driven snow. There was only a great stillness and a sky gone hard and clear and depthless, and a cold that sank and sank as though the bottom had fallen out of the world. It came down off the northern plains in the night, silent, and by the second morning The mercury in the tube Barton Reeve kept nailed by his store door had fallen further than any man on the bar had seen it, and it did not stop. For 9 days that silent iron coal lay over the gulch and would not lift, deepening at every dawn. The air so still that the smoke of the cabins rose straight and thin as string into a sky the color of a knife blade. The snow squealing underfoot, the great pines banging like guns in the dark as the frost split their hearts, and Cold Kettle Bar shut down into itself and simply endured. The tube by Reeve's door passed 30 below and past 40. And on the coldest black morning of that terrible stretch, the storekeeper wiped the frost from the glass with a shaking hand and read it at 52 degrees below zero, lower than he had believed the country could go, and said so to every man who fought his way in to crowd about his stove, in a camp that was learning, hour by silent hour, exactly what its bought stoves and its board walls were truly worth. 52 below. At such a cold, the ordinary rules of a mountain winter fell away, and a harder arithmetic took their place. Dry pine burned with a thin, hurrying flame that seemed to throw no heat at all into so vast and total a cold. The miners of Cold Kettle Bar, who had done the plain and sensible and modern thing, and set good iron stoves in tight-looking cabins of single board, learned now what the modern way was worth at 52 below, that a board wall, however new, was scarcely a wall at all against such a cold, but let the frost drive clean through it into the room no matter how the stove was stoked, and that no woodpile, however proudly a man had ricked it in the golden autumn, stood high enough when the stove must roar day and night merely to keep the middle of. One small room short of freezing. They gave up trying to warm the whole cabin and crowded close about the stoves in their coats and blankets, and sat up in shifts through the endless black nights to feed the flames, and watched their cordwood ricks go down with a growing and private dread. The frost furred the inside of the walls and crept white across the floors. A man's breath fell as rime on his own blankets. Here the water froze in the kettle a hand's breadth from the fire. There a cabin went so bitter its two owners abandoned it and floundered through the deadly cold to crowd in on a neighbor, and more than one proud stove-warmed cabin came very near in those 9 silent days to being the death of the men who had laughed at the Northerner from its doorway. In the long cabin on Cold Kettle Bar, on the brick bed the whole gulch had laughed at, Wang Fu-shan and Ah Sing and the men who shared their roof were warm. They were not merely getting through it, they were warm, steadily, plainly, undeniably warm. And they held so through the first day of the great cold, and the second, and the third, and did not fail. Each morning and each evening Wang fired the hearth at the end of the bed exactly as he had fired it since the autumn, the small cooking fire that boiled the rice and the tea, and no more, and that, twice in a day, was the whole of their battle against the worst cold in the camp's short memory. 2 little meal fires burned to cook by. All the rest the brick did. Through the silent killing days and the black splitting nights, the charged platform gave its banked warmth steadily up into the men who slept upon it, and the thick clay held it, and the quilts held it closer, and there was nothing for the cold to take. It could not wait for the fire to die in the small hours and then walk in, as it walked into the stove cabins. For there was no heating fire to die. The warmth it wanted to kill was not in any flame, but lay asleep in a ton of clay, and clay does not go cold between one supper and the next. While the rest of the bar sat up in shifts feeding roaring stoves and losing, The men on Wang's kang slept whole nights through, and the little woodpile that had been the camp's last best proof of his folly went down so slowly it was scarcely worth the name of burning. Wang had carried a small thermometer up from his railroad years. A plain brass case thing a section boss had once used to judge the setting of the frost, and he had hung it on the log wall at the head of the bed, at the height where a man's face lay on the mats. On the coldest black morning of the whole silent siege, the morning Reeve's glass down at the store stood at 52 below. Wang woke in the dark and looked at it. The needle on the wall above the kang stood at 68 degrees above zero. 68 above, warm as a spring afternoon, with no fire burning anywhere in the cabin, the morning's cooking fire not yet lit, the tea water standing liquid in its crock, and Ah Sing asleep and easy at his side under the quilt, no nearer to freezing than he had been in September. 68 above within, against 52 below without, a gulf of 120 degrees, held across one thickness of green pine logs and one low bed of creek clay, in the worst cold that country had ever shown to living men, held up by nothing in this world but a bank of hand made mud brick charged the evening before by the same small fire that had cooked the men's supper, giving its stored warmth back into the dark like a debt paid slow and sure. Wang looked a while at the needle, then laid his broad hand flat on the warm clay the way he had done every hard morning of his life that mattered, and rose to build the little fire that would cook the rice and, in the cooking, charge the bed again for the day and the night to come. Down in his fine frame house above the bar, the reckoning had come to Barton Reeve. His proud 2-story house of clean sawnboard drank cordwood at 52 below the way a big, thin-walled house does. And by the 7th day of the silent cold, with the upstairs long since surrendered to the frost, and his household crowded shivering into the one back room, and his own great woodpile burned frighteningly low, the loud and forward-looking storekeeper made a poor morning's judgment. He wrapped himself and set out on foot down the frozen bar toward a neighbor who was said to have wood still to sell, a walk he had made 100 times and thought nothing of. But a man's judgment is a poor guide at 52 below, where the cold is a live thing that takes the warmth out of a body faster than the body can make it. The killing air got into him within a few 100 yards. Took his hands first, and then the sureness out of his legs, and then the plain sense out of his head, and when he turned back, he could no longer find his own lit house in the blue dusk. He blundered off the packed trail into the deep snow, going in circles now, the cold climbing his arms, and the one light he could find in all that freezing blue was a low, warm glow down among the cabins to his left, the small greased paper window of the long cabin he had mocked from behind his own counter all the autumn long. He beat on the low door with hands he could no longer feel, and it opened, and the warmth rolled out over him into the killing cold like something solid a man could lean his weight against, and the broad hands of the northerner took hold of him and hauled him in and shut the door on the cold behind him. They laid him on the warm brick at the near end of the bed, and the stored heat of the clay came up into him slow and deep and even, the way brick heat does, while Ah Sing chafed his dead white hands and got hot tea into him. And the fierce pain of the thawing came on and told him he would keep his fingers. And it was while he sat there, wrapped in their quilts in the low lamplight, that Barton Reeve looked about that warm cabin for the great roaring stove that surely must be making such a heat, and found none. There was no stove at all. There was only the long, low bed of gray brick and clay he had been laid upon, warm as a bake oven, and at the near end of it a small, cold cooking hearth with nothing in it but the gray ash of a fire burned out since supper, hours dead. And the whole long cabin warm as a kitchen off a bed that had no fire in it anywhere. He put his aching hand down flat on the clay beside him and felt the steady, living warmth of it coming up out of the brick, and he was quiet a long while, a loud man gone wholly silent, understanding at last exactly what it was he had been laughing at through the autumn. "There is no fire in it," he said at last, low, as if it were a charge he could not make hold. "You are keeping alive at 52 below on a warm bed and a pot of rice, and I have been selling wood against this cold like a man bailing a boat with a civet." Wang told him only that the bed had had its supper fire and would hold to the morning meal, and that his grandfather had died warm at 90 on no better, and Reeve, with the painful heat coming back into his hands, said lower still that he had been a loud fool about the Northerner and the bed alike, and had said things across his own counter he had no business ever to have said. And Wang Fu-shan, who had no gloating anywhere in him, told him to move up nearer the warm end, for there was heat in the brick enough for a fool as well as for a wise man. He kept Barton Reeve on the warm bed through the worst of it, and sent him home 2 days on in a lull, roped to Ah Sing's arm with a hot brick off the hearth wrapped in sacking under his coat, and before the great cold broke, 2 miners from a frozen-out cabin down the bar fought their way to the long cabin on the word that there was warmth at the Northerners. And the brick bed built for the men of one roof held them all, and stayed warm through the whole of it on the same 2 meal fires a day, because the warmth was not in any blaze that could be burned down, but in the clay, which gave the cold nothing to kill. When the silent cold at last let go on the 10th day, and a low hard sun came up over a white and beaten gulch, the men who came out of Wang Fu-shan's cabin came out warm and whole, and every one of them alive, into a camp that had frozen to the bone and burned its wood piles down to chips, and the hard men of Cold Kettle Bar did not laugh about the brick bed any more. Barton Reeve least of all. He went back to his cold grand house a changed man, and in the spring, quietly, with no crowd by to see him do it. He walked out to the long cabin and asked the Northerner to show him how the flues were turned and the bricks were laid and the hearth was set, and Wang Fu-shan showed him the whole of it, as his own father had shown him on the plains of Shantung. A few of the poorer men on the bar, the ones who had come nearest to freezing in their bought stoves, swallowed their pride and laid up low brick beds of their own against the next winter, and blessed the trick ever after. Most did not, for a man's pride in how his warmth is made runs deeper, very often, than his memory of one bad cold. But the story of that January, the 9 silent days, and the 52 below, when the proud stove-warmed men very nearly froze in their fine board cabins, and the stranger they had laughed at came through it warm at 68 above, with a thawed mocker on his bed and no fire under any of them, was told up and down Cold Kettle Bar for as long as there was a camp there to tell it. They had called it madness, the bed a man ran a fire through and slept upon, right up until the cold came and asked its one hard question, whether there was any warmth in the cabin that the fire's dying would not take away with it, and a board wall and a roaring stove had no answer to give, while a bed of once warmed clay answered it all the night long. As they say in the cold north country he came from, warm your bed with the fire that cooks your rice, and let the smoke pay you twice. For the flame that only blazes is a flame half wasted, and the cold takes back all the warmth a man does not first give to the clay.